I'm Katie Tamblin, and welcome back to Ecodove. Today, we'll be talking with Shakirat Shittu about her dissertation on modern slavery in industrial supply chains. But first, let's talk a little about the scale of the problem. 49.6 million people in 2021 were living in conditions classed as modern slavery. 27.6 million of those were in forced labor, and 22 million of them were in forced marriage.
Thanks so much for joining, Shakira. It's lovely to see you. Do you want to start just by introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'm Shakirat Shittu. I have been working in supply chain. I'm a supply chain professional, basically. First, thank you so much for bringing me on board, Ecodove. It's really a privilege to be on this platform. To talk about modern slavery. Like you said, something I had done my dissertation on, and I'm quite passionate about. I have had over a decade experience in supply chain, working majorly in the oil and gas industry. And interestingly, my career had spanned in the supply chain, not just in procurement. It's been more of tactical buying, strategic sourcing, supply chain risk management, basically, where I had, well, I would say vendor management, but then holistically is more like supply chain risk management, where I had to, like I said, I'd worked on things around modern slavery and things like that, onboarding vendors and ensuring that you're working with the right vendors. And then in the last 1 year, I'd done my master's in supply chain and logistics management at the University of Westminster. And then I had done my dissertation in ESG risk performance, focusing on modern slavery in oil and gas supply chain.
How do you define sustainability?
For me, sustainability is, I'll look at it from the business lens, and I'll say it's a case of trying to achieve social and economic benefits within environmental constraints. So basically, it's, in other words, I would say, like, using three pillars: people, planet, and profit. It's an ecosystem of these three things to achieve long-term social and economic benefits, basically. So when you talk about people, you're talking about people's welfare, equality, equity or equality, and then when you talk about the planet, of course, the environment. And when you talk about the profit, in terms of business, is about competitiveness and growth, efficiency, and things like that. So it's basically putting all those three elements, in an ecosystem: people, planet, and profit.
So can you just tell us a little bit about what you found in your research as far as how are people enslaved around the world today?
Yeah, so I mean, when you hear the slavery, there is it's a contemporary one that you would know, when people were bound in chains and things like that. But things have evolved now. There is, some subtle kind of slavery in business life, in supply chains, in our everyday life, which, I mean, is not as visible as binding people in chains, carrying them on trafficking them through different channels for exploitation purpose. But for me, modern slavery is, it's a term that can be used to describe any unethical and abusive behavior, such as maybe child labor, forced labor, and things like that. Things as little as, confiscating your workers' passports, people working under threat or some kind of coercion, can be seen as modern slavery, and I mean, this happens in everyday life, especially at across supply chains, if so to speak, where because people, there is poverty, or there is, where you see migrant workers and all that, and people just want to make ends meet. So some things like poor welfare can be seen as modern slavery, when people live in some kind of hostels that is not habitable, things that actually are not, that are abusive to human beings, in workplace, in any sort of form, threats can be seen as modern slavery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And why is it important that we look at supply chains holistically rather than just looking at a single individual business when we address modern slavery issues?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, the supply chain is a very, very important part of any business. So basically, you as a business, you could decide that, oh, want to I want to be ethical. I'm doing things ethically, but then I'm going to outsource my things to my suppliers. Supply chain definitely involves people. Supply demands people working for you. You have suppliers working for you. And in that bit, you're kind of pushing the risk to the suppliers. You But the thing about it, looking at it holistically, is you can say that, yes, I've pushed my risk to suppliers, but you don't know what your suppliers are doing. So you need to look at all tiers of when I say tiers in supply chain, is all, for example, all level, all gates within your supply chain. You can say that, for example, there is things around, I'll take the fashion industry, for example, where people tend to offshore production, and that's like two tier. There are two streams to this industry: the downstream and the upstream. So the upstream is basically like sourcing, the production, and all that, which is probably done, for example, maybe for fashion industry, that if a fashion store in like a clothing line in the UK will probably outsource these things to somewhere in India for cheap labor, right? Because of the low minimum wage, poverty, or that kind of thing. And you can say that I want to exonerate myself as a UK supplier and say, well, I don't care what my supplier in India does, as long as I get the clothes, or the clothes in good time, cheap, and all that. I don't care if they're using children to work in this factory, if people don't get to have enough break, if overtime is not, if people work overtime without breaks, or they live in bad hostels, bad condition, no fans where they are working, no good ventilation. You are literally, you're actually not being sustainable as a company, as an organization, because the end product of or whatever you're selling has been manufactured as a result of modern slavery. Mm-hmm. So it's important for organized businesses to look at every level, every tier of their, both upstream and downstream. My experience has been in the oil and gas industry. And, you could argue that, yeah, there is a lot of safety, HSE, and whatnot of you in the oil and gas industry, but there is still a bit of modern slavery because, and like I said, this happens mostly in the upstream areas where businesses will try to exonerate themselves from these issues, where the manpower companies or agents are bringing unskilled laborers, like welders, fitters. These fitters are not directly employed by the big oil and gas companies. They are employed through tiers of their supply chain, maybe tier 1, tier 2, and they are the ones. They are not the third-party companies are literally responsible. The manpower agents are responsible for these unskilled workers, and they can decide to pay them less than minimum wage, which is still a part of modern slavery. They can decide to make them travel hours on the road before they get and start work immediately without any rest. Those are things that that inform modern slavery. So it can happen in every industry, but it is mainly seen somewhere around the tier 1, like upstream of where there is production, basically, or manufacturing. Mm-hmm. So it's important to look at your supply chain holistically based on that.
Absolutely. And so just to make sure, kind of to summarize and recap what you're saying, to make sure I understand it, is when businesses, quite often when they are pursuing lower cost, they will look to suppliers of labor, to your point, whether it's welders or fitters or people working on site, or whether it's offshoring their production of goods like clothing. And in the pursuit of lower cost, then they might accidentally or even kind of blindly or knowingly accept that there's a risk that they're not being unethical, but by outsourcing that to a supplier, all they've done is outsource unethical business practice, because unless they're doing really detailed checks, those suppliers might be providing lower cost goods by compromising the standards to which their workers are working. Is that fair? Like under the conditions under which those workers are working?
Yeah, absolutely. That's just recapping it. Outsourcing is outsourcing is a major risk of where the high risk of modern slavery happening in especially the upstream, or let me say the tier one supplier, just for laymen to understand where there is production and all that. Yeah, outsourcing, it's a major place where you can find modern slavery.
Yeah, and you mentioned that agencies often provide workers, and this is something that I've seen a lot in my research and working with other experts on modern slavery as well, that agencies that bring in workers, quite often we see employment malpractice in those. So let's talk a little bit about, can you explain when I'm a big company and I want to bring in workers that are not employed directly by me, how does that work when I go to an agency? What is the agency for, and what service does that agency provide me as a big company?
Well, the agency is literally helping you to recruit workers. And in recruiting workers, you trust them to provide you workers that are fit to do that role. I mean, they would get money off you at a percentage and then pay the workers. Then, I mean, every country has a minimum wage, right? If you expect that they will be responsible enough to at least pay the workers the minimum wage, right? So that's basically what a third party company or a managing agent does for you. So for you to basically that's what the third party does for you. They literally are the middleman between you and the staff or the worker that is working on your site and working for you.
And then therefore, if you're not employing those workers directly, it's really important that you check that the agency you use would employ those workers to the same standard of working conditions that you would, right?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. And why is addressing modern slavery and ESG principles as a whole, you mentioned people, planet, and profit, why is it good business? Why are more and more organizations starting to think about this more holistically and address modern slavery? Do you think it is just awareness, or are they finding that it has benefits for de-risking their business as well?
Well, I mean, before now, it used to be, you mentioned ESG. I'll just say ESG. ESG is environmental social governance. I'm sure just for laymen that are listening to us, and that's a big thing now in the business world. But before now, years back, maybe a decade ago, it used to be CSR, which is corporate social responsibility, and that is in itself was a voluntary action. But the reason why businesses are beginning to hone sustainability and make it a big part of their business now is because ESG has now added a bit more content to the CSR concept, which makes it ESG is not a a financial tool, for investors. So these things around your ESG rating determines which people would invest in your business. So if you have good ESG ratings, then or ESG score, then you tend to have more investors. So in a couple of years, we'll probably see things evolving where you would not be able to get money from the bank if you don't have good ESG scores. So, and this ESG, like I said, is environmental social governance. It has to do still more the people, planet, and profits in a way, and it's now moved away from CSR, which was voluntary, where people just had to, based on maybe UN global human rights principles of just, you have to be sustainable, you have to plant trees, or you have to do things around that area, and it has to be voluntary. Nobody's holding you accountable for it. Now there is money attached to it. There is value attached to it. So it's more like if you don't shape up, you'll be shipped out as a business, literally.
Absolutely. And where is modern slavery happening? Because I think a lot of people will be surprised to find how widespread these practices are. So is modern slavery and worker exploitation confined to specific regions of the globe, or where is it happening?
Modern slavery happens everywhere. I think a couple of years ago, maybe last year or 2 years ago, while I was doing my master's, I was doing a research on the fashion industry and sustainability, and I came across that there was a boohoo scandal where workers are paid somewhere in England, where workers are paid less than maybe about £3 or something ridiculous, less than the minimum wage, And this goes to say that it doesn't only happen, in undeveloped countries. It could happen in developed countries. It could, but there's high risk or higher risk in countries where there is less development, where there is poverty. But in industries where there is, very there's a high amount of low skilled or unskilled labor, like agriculture, construction, things like that. From my research, I realized that, where there is inadequate laws or regulation protecting people, for example, maybe places around Asia, like in Singapore, in places like that, yeah, they are developed countries, but there are laws that kind of are not really explicitly against slavery or modern slavery of any sort. You could have, domestic staff working for you, and they're not necessarily covered, under the law. So it can happen anywhere. Yes, there's a notion that, it could probably just happen in places like in Africa or where there is very little development, but it happens here as well. It happens in developed countries as well. So areas where there is intensive labor, like agriculture, construction, where there is poverty, high poverty, where there is high amount of migrant workers, and where there is inadequate laws protecting staff welfare.
And how does human trafficking, so you touched a little bit on this issue of it being, there being a high risk around particularly populations of migrant workers. So how does human trafficking, what is human trafficking, and how does it relate to modern slavery? Are they the same thing? Are they intertwined? How does that fit in?
That's quite an interesting question. And it came up really in my research during my dissertation. And what I was able to establish is human traffic. I mean, the words are used intertwined, but from my research, I could conclude that human trafficking is a channel for modern slavery. It's not the actual exploitation. So it's more like a tube or a transfer process for slavery to happen. It's not the actual act. So you're not exploiting people through. You're not exploiting. Human trafficking is not an act of exploitation. It's just a channel through which exploitation, which is modern slavery, which it occurs. So it's they're all linked, but there could be slavery without somebody being trafficked. So I could be in the UK, not moving. Nobody's moving me in a bus or on a ferry through the back doors of some country, but I could still be exploited. For example, the boohoo scandal that I mentioned. you know, the people living in the UK and all that, but maybe because they just have to make ends meet. So that's the difference between trafficking, in my opinion, and or from my research, and modern slavery. Human trafficking is more like a channel or a system through which slavery can occur.
How does supply chain transparency help us to root out and address worker exploitation?
Yeah, so I mean, when you say transparency, I'll break it down to things around, you know, let's bring it home to the UK, UK Modern Slavery Act since 2015, you know, where companies are mandated, or it's compulsory for them to literally have like statements to say they are not involved in modern slavery. That's transparency. It's a good start, but it's just from my research, it's not been effective. Other countries like the Scandinavians or in the EU have taken this further, like the Norwegian Transparency Act and the German Supply Chain Act, where there is now, you know, legislations and enforcement, right? Even in America, there is the California Transparency, Supply Chain Transparency Act and all that. They're all good stats, but it could be said that they are not so stringent. Some of them, because it's still voluntary, it makes it more like, yeah, we just have to say, people say what they want, or organizations would say what the government would like to hear, or the you know, the regulators would like to hear. They only disclose what they want to disclose, as much as they want to disclose. So yes, it's a good place, but with things are evolving now. You know, it started with the California Transparency, Supply Chain Transparency Act in America, and then the Modern Slavery Act came on board, which was just a case of disclosure. Just say, I mean, even in companies' annual reports now, there is sustainability bits, just to ESG scoring and things like that. It's a good start. They would at least say what they are able to say, or what they want to say, their own truth. But then we need to be able to get to a point where there is stringent legislations and enforcement to actually speak the truth of the workers.
Mm-hmm. So to your point, it's one thing. So the Modern Slavery Act here in the UK, and certainly many of them, require a policy statement that every organization over a certain size has a policy, you know, saying that they will not that they will find and kind of root out modern slavery. But to your point, it's just a policy statement. It's not, you know, it doesn't require that they investigate and ensure that there is no modern slavery actually happening in their supply chains. So, you know, so it's the voluntary assessment or policy statements are not enough. So what should companies be doing to root out modern slavery?
I'll still go back to my research. From what I gathered, there has to be what we'll call the triangular method, which is a case of due diligence, audits, desktop audits, and labor audits. What is common is due diligence, where companies just get their own. You know, you want to get your suppliers on board. You just do desktop audit or due diligence, where they just submit documentations like those policies. Oh, we don't do modern slavery. Oh, we employ, and all that. And then maybe site audits, which is, you know, and then they go site audit and they just interview or check the papers of the company and check with the management of the company. But they would still say their own truth, what they want you to see, right? So to actually make it effective and be able to, you know, tackle this endemic act of modern slavery, I think the third bit of the triangle is to literally to do labor audits. interview the workers, audit the workers without the management knowing. So you have due diligence, site audits, and labor audits. So that triangle kind of, helps to nip it on the board, or be able to, because I mean, you could have the management say, use the first two tools, which is due diligence and site audits, to say their own truth, but then you get the truth of the worker through labor audits, and then you can make your facts and understand if the company is actually engaging in any form or sort of modern slavery.
And so it's about going beyond just a tick box exercise and really getting dedicated to finding out what the worker experience is.
Absolutely, take more. If you're outsourcing to a company in India, you best be prepared to travel from the UK to India to check and speak to the workers and all that. I mean, and then if you think about all those costs, you might decide to be like, I don't want to offshore anymore. I don't want to outsource. I might just do my production at home. And then you're saving the planet. You're not traveling too much. You're not, bring it home. Be sustainable, because you want to get cheap labor, and then you have to, bring it home where there is legislation, even though they are not yet enough. At least there is rules saying, in some countries, for example, Nigeria, I've not heard about anything about modern slavery act. In most places in Africa, there's nothing like modern slavery act, or modern slavery policies. So, I mean, for me, just not just about the ticking the boxes exercise or desktop audits. You need to take action, basically. Audit, labor audits, all the way.
And what can we as consumers and everyday people do to try to hold the businesses around us to account?
I mean, for example, in the UK, the modern slavery, there is a lot of companies have been responsible, especially the fashion industry. For example, ASOS, like I did a bit of research on them during my dissertation. They had now started publishing the list of their first tier production warehouses, in countries where they are, Turkey, India, and those places. We need to be more responsible. Check where whatever we are purchasing, the root of it, the supply chain process of it, not just focusing on buying cheap goods, but focus on how the process of how these goods are manufactured from raw material to finish. Could there be any case of a child has been used to them to get this product finished? Just be responsible yourself. Be aware. Be informed. It's not about cheap products. It's about doing what is right.
So I wanted to ask you if you want to talk about how open your educational institution was to your dissertation topic.
Initially, when I made a proposal for this dissertation, my supervisor was like, or my tutor was like, no, that has nothing to do with supply chain and logistics. It doesn't make any I don't see any value this is bringing in and all that. So I tried to convince him and explain to him based on my experience, because I had worked on a lot of modern slavery while I was in my former work, where in BW Offshore, where I was a vendor qualification coordinator, and I did a lot of modern slavery, GDPR, them kind of things, GSI and all that, So my tutor was really not interested in my topic and wanted me to change it. But I kind of pressed on. I tried to convince him. And in the end, I got a very good feedback from him. And he was like, this is the first time in years where I had learned from a dissertation.
Oh, wow. How exciting.
Yeah, that each dissertation, students tell me what I already know. But you made me know that, you made me learn something different. That even in logistics, he's a logistic professor. So I was like, trucking is a place where you can get high risk of modern slavery. And I was like, I didn't even know that. So a lot of people are interested. He was more interested. My tutor was more interested in carbon emissions and all that. But there is more to like I said, it's an ecosystem of planet, people, and profit. So we cannot just take away, we cannot just isolate environment. You see people talking about sustainability and the focus is environment. We should have a mindset change. There is more to the environment, which people and profits, which is, really important, in sustainability, right? People, planet, and profit is not just the planet. Without the people, there is no planet. And people have to make profit while living in the planet.